let's get started. Lucy, thank you so much for being with us. Um, and I guess, the start. One of the things I find really fascinating about your work is the intersection of the global and local, which is something that we're really interested in at LJU. But obviously, I think you started at Cambridge City Council in emergency planning, but you've also worked at these across the world on these massive front page news events. And one of the things that when you did a great podcast for us a month ago, and one of the things you talked about there was how much we can learn from each other. And your next book is about lessons from emergency planning. And I wondered if we could maybe start there. What should we be looking to learn from each other as we go forward?
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me. And it's such an interesting point, isn't it? Going very big and then very small, macro, micro, global, local. And so the very first incidents that I worked on were for a private disaster management firm, which a lot of local government places have contracts with for the very, very worst case scenario. And I joined at a time when the world was in utter crisis, really. A very similar feeling, I suppose, to now. We just had September the 11th and a series of other disasters. And the world is changing all around you. There's massive debates, and then you're also working on this very micro level. So my role often was, for example, for 9/11 to send British teams out to work at Ground Zero, the most kind of human and sort of close to operational work you can get. And actually that was the very first time that I did a lot with local authorities, because we were negotiating the contracts all the time for those worst case scenario contracts. And then I fiercely wanted to be independent, and I wanted to be able to talk about disaster management in the world. So I set up my own consultancy, but that wasn't going to pay the mortgage. And I saw a job at risk management in Cambridge City. And that was a very, very happy 5 years. And it was very, very hard to leave that job, actually. And I only left it really because the disaster management was becoming so big. It was a part-time role. And actually, what your question typifies is the problem, in that you needed to have loyalty to the local. You needed to be very, very focused on residents' lives. And that's what local government is and should be about. And sometimes, and to this day, actually, it's definitely some of my most happy and focused times. And I think the other thing about that role, which sort of typifies your question, I remember us getting a briefing in on how climate change, this great big mammoth of a topic, was going to affect local authorities. And with no disrespect to the strategic manager at Cambridge City at all, as risk manager, I was given 10 minutes on a
Oh,
briefing to explain what that might mean for local authority planning in the next 20 years. And what tends to happen, I think, in local government planning, local government thinking, is we are constantly swamped by the now. And it is very, very hard, A, to think strategically, but also to stay in your box. The risk management officer was quite low level. And the idea that she would assemble senior management and say, your whole policy needs to now be viewed through this different lens. And what you found was, for example, local government has had to make very reactive climate policy the last few years. Every decision we make around, say, flooding, lots of local councils, for example, are wrestling with an issue we called managed retreat. So are parts of their areas still safe to return people back to after incident? We see that with environmental contamination, but also with flooding and other weather events. And so one of the things for me has been creating space for a more wild card thinker. And I think that was another thing that, the Cambridge City of the time, whether it still does, I hope so, allowed me to do. Maybe it was the sort of cerebral surroundings of the great colleges, but they tolerated their officers coming with big global issues, big concerns. So, for example, thinking about how do you right now in your spaces and meetings allow people to bring to the table what food insecurity will mean. So I did a thread, and I've learned to post in very stark terms because you've only got 160 characters. So I did a thread on how the world is about to get much more expensive. And in the answers to that, you'll see people use what I call hopium. So like, maybe, Lucy, it'll get cheaper. You don't know. Okay, if it
oh,
gets cheaper, then this thread is A, obsolete, and B, we have a bit more money. Yahoo! But if we don't, What does life getting more expensive mean for you, your staff, and your residents? And so, what I've learned to do, and I'm old now, it's taken a long time. I was very esoteric, I think, when I used to brief in my early 20s, is turn it into something. What does it mean for your residents? I mean, right now you'll see from my social media, I'm obsessed with bin strikes and bins. What bins not being empty says to communities. It says decomposition. It says crisis. It says we haven't got you. We won't be there for you if things go badly. So one of the things about the global coming home is finding ways to turn it very quickly into what it means for your residents. And also local government should always be like the best emergency planners. We're like fashion houses. We're 2 seasons ahead. Ignore that big yellow orb in the sky out there. Ignore the summer. You are planning to get your residents through the winter. And that's a mindset that we waste sometimes halcyon days of planning because it is too nice outside. And we the way humans work, we're like dormice. We forget again how difficult October to February is going to be. Now is the time to look at things with your strategy, but also things like your scrutiny. And one big thing about the global is rethinking your relationship with members. I am having some great conversations with elected members about these big issues, about learning. They're very interested in what reports I'm reading. So bringing, as wherever possible, some members into the discussion. And, just to perhaps answer everybody's questions all at once, very, very interested, let's use the word interested to stay positive in what the 1st of May brings. Are all those new members we may see on that page where the most important role of elected members is to get their residents through, is my view.
Yeah, I mean, and I was so many questions, but and we've got lots of questions that came in from the audience in advance, which I'll get to in a minute. But I guess just to just carry on that, we're going to have a lot of new members come 1st of May. Some maybe with more or less, possibly less, pre-existing level of engagement in local government and understanding of what local government does. But I think many people would already have felt the experience of elect that kind of optimism sort of bias, that sort of it'll be all right, or let's not work, we don't want to talk about the bad things. That's sort of kind of programmed in, baked
Yeah.
into how we do politics, because you don't win elections by telling people everything's going to be awful. You win elections by promising people that you're going to make things better. So I think a lot of people will have found it quite hard to have those sorts of conversations with elected members. How do you move them into that space if they're not already there?
And one of the interesting things is me absolutely, and you can gauge my opinion on some things from social media, my love of food, my love of Pink the artist, and my love of watching the Kardashians. There are some things where you can game what my belief system is, but I am genuinely apolitical, and I can genuinely work wherever possible with everybody. There are some belief systems, obviously, I'm going to stand up very strongly against, but generally, I think one of the things that I worry about is our polarization in, an officer's politics, for example, being very, very clear to members from perhaps a different party. And one of the things that we are going to have to do, I think, is really set some political with a big P beliefs aside to get people through. And I use that language very deliberately. One of my roles is to view our plans for things like excess body storage in
Mm.
local authorities. Let's be really stark here about where emergency planning goes. So one of the things that I'm very interested in is we know that, for example, on May the 1st, we will see a protest vote without a doubt. And we will see if as I get up early, throw my hair back and read as much as I can. I read all the manifestos. I'm interested in every political party. I don't choose to shut a party out because they're not my politics. So if you see some of the perhaps what we might call more protest politics at the moment, it's making a lot of promises about what MPs will do. What elected ministers will do, but also obviously MPs for some of the by-elections. What elected members will do when they get into power, if you call it that, in local government. And they are very unrealistic claims to a local populace, And so one of the challenges will be, do those, and I will take them at face value that they do those new members and I don't mean this paternalistically at all, understand what the role of, say, cabinet member is in local government, and do they understand that a lot of work is necessarily, in a good way, me and my colleague Dr. Deeming write about this a lot, necessarily mundane. That's not a negative term. It's about planning. It's about operational decisions involving children's lives. We don't mean mundane negatively at all, but we do mean operational. There's also a lot of processes to work within. So one of the dissonances that I'm seeing that I think is very, very relevant to your members come May the 2nd is the difference between the promises made to your local electorate and actually what local governance is, and local governance in crisis, because we are inside the aftermath of a pandemic. We are going into a very difficult time. I say all this with a smile on my face. We've got this, but we have to spell that out. One of the things that Cambridge did teach me as well is members and indeed executive team of councils can be quite hard to brief negatively. At this age and with this experience behind me, and it always helps to have a Sunday Times bestseller, I can do negative briefings. But often your younger officer colleagues, that will be seen as poisoning the well, not being
Yeah.
part of the team, being very anti-British. I was at an event yesterday. I can't talk too much about it, but it'll be broadcast in June. And certainly anything that went against the optimism message was considered pretty treacherous.
Yeah.
So how
Yeah.
do you train your senior managers to allow what I call the removal of hopium, a pessimistic optimist, a briefing to a reasonable worst case scenario that's very alive to the positives that we would call, say, protective factors, um, but doesn't nudge, doesn't try and oversell a position, doesn't say, well, we'll use behavioral comms to try and win the day, is very authentic. That could be quite a big shift in some councils' leadership, including officers as well as elected members.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that our members report over the last few years actually is because there's such churn in elected members, you get people who are becoming leaders of council, cabinet members, who are not only new into that role, but are fairly new into being councillors full stop. So they may only have been on the council for 6 months or so when suddenly they find themselves in leadership positions. So you don't have that kind of acquired experience of the mundane operational stuff that you point to. One of the other things that strikes me in your work is the extension of time frame. So you just talked about, you know, planning for winter during the summer. But one of the other things that strikes me is you actually talk quite a lot about that you need to be the getting to know your community, the almost kind of ethnographic work of understanding in depth who the community are, what their values are, what they're going to respond to in a not, way before you're even thinking about scenario planning or any sort of emergency planning. That kind of getting to know, that knowledge of the community is an essential prerequisite of effective emergency planning.
Absolutely. And I think there's a myth in emergency management that we need to know the scenario. Somebody like me is much more interested in the consequences. So we're always being, there's always an attempt to gotcha local government with FOI requests. And one of them is always about this time of year, have you got any game plans for alien invasion, zombie invasion? And actually my answer would always be our plans would, who knows how robust they would be, but actually we're not interested in necessarily what's causing it. We're about consequence management a lot of the time. Loss of access to places, issues for our people, issues for food, issues for safety, and that the scenario can sort of happen over here for that. So I think one of the big issues for us at the moment is thinking about consequence management in a very different way. What was your question again? Because I've got distracted
So
on the
it was a reflection that you have to start much earlier. You have to start with
yes, the
getting to know the
community
community before
and
you get
and
into emergency planning.
one thing again, and this is, I used to ask a question at the start of local government training about who came from the local area, and I don't ask it anymore because I don't want to imply any kind of blame if you are commuting in. Or what we did see in the pandemic was excellent leadership appointments in local councils, and perhaps people do live outside. And also, I think with something like Grenfell, it was very expensive to live in the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, so a lot of officers commuted into that part of London rather than live there. So there's no reflection on the fact anymore that officers don't always live in their borough or their area, but it is relevant sometimes, because often what we see is both the officers are both responders to an event, and that can be a very chronic issue. They are experiencing it themselves, or they are indeed very affected by it, or their family are themselves. I always give the example of going to some aftermath work in Humber where they'd been very badly flooded, and I think it was the director of social services sort of flew in half an hour late, and it was because he too was flooded and his entire family were living out of a back bedroom in his sister-in-law's house. So the idea of the responder coming from the place and knowing the place. I can always tell the difference between a community impact assessment that's written by responders of place and the community impact assessment that's sort of parachuted in. It was very strongly felt, I think, my experience, not to make a generalization, but for example, I've been supporting Sefton, and a lot of Sefton officers are either Sefton residents or specifically Southport residents. And that tends to come across in knowing their community, but also a useful protection of their community. They're very heightened to any kind of negative use of things like the negative indices of deprivation, any kind of prejudice in impact assessments that we see, understanding multiple communities much better. And one test I often give executives in local government is writing a preemptive community impact assessment and watching for that nuance. So perhaps writing up, we've seen a fire in a travelers community, writing up the impact assessment with the language that we need to understand for in terms of how the response needs to go, but writing that in a very non-prejudiced and non-assumptive way. And that is a real test, because again, that comes down, you see me write and tweet a lot about, for example, the duty of candor. We need to think about this in terms of not just candor in terms of negative information, not lying, but how our material might be perceived when we think we've done a good job, but perhaps there is some assumption or prejudice in there.
And you talked about a couple of English examples there, flooding in Humber, knife attacks in Southport. You've also worked on a lot of incidents around the world. Those lessons that you just talked about in terms, are they globally applicable? Or are
Yeah,
they different in different places?
one of the things, it's quite interesting, the journey that I've been on since the books have come out, and Come What May is has just been it's not out yet, but it was at the International London Book Fair, and it's quite interesting to see a journey that both books have been on, so When the Dust Settles and Come What May, in terms of international audience, because when the Dust Settles was a pitch rather than a physical book, the idea was, well, British planning will be very British centric. That British planner Lucy will have no real extrapolation for anywhere else. And what's been wonderful, and we'll see what happens with Come What May, is just how translatable the lessons are. And that's literally translatable. So I was having a discussion with my Korean translators this week about a couple of terminologies that I use. I've been quite heavily translated into Polish for the Polish media. I did a lot of Spanish media. And particularly local government media in Spanish. Spain were very interested in these lessons after flooding. And so, while being very respectful that there are cultural and diaspora differences, yes, I can sort of absolutely sort of point to and prove now that these lessons travel. Some of the basic concepts, the humanity, what people need in their initial stages of shock and trauma, a cup of tea, sometimes culturally you have to be careful with a warm hug, but certainly the concept of a smile, how well a smile travels. So in China, I was called the smiley lady, some reaching out at times of trauma with comfort and compassion. So a lot of this does travel. And then there were specific things. One of the things I could never do a local government event without mentioning was my campaign around hashtag cash not stuff, which is to get local communities to never, ever, unless very specific circumstances, donate their secondhand items in a disaster. Oh my God, that reaches. I may well have been. I'm trying to guess whether it's a fake account, but I've been retweeted with the Paris Hilton and Kim Kardashian's family and all of these kind of things. Maybe a fake parody account, but very big in LA as a message.
Yeah.
And also retweeted into both Spanish and Polish, as I say, after flooding. Detailed interview in Germany similarly. And I think, one of the things that's really interesting is how universal some of these concepts are. But also you're all having the same challenges. One thing Britain, I think, does do differently. We did a seminar on this week, and my wonderful colleague Amanda Coleman has just shared the notes of it, which was on malinformation and misinformation and disinformation. Is that the British probably get to outrage at their local government a lot quicker. This was something that the Spanish really teased out in me with the Valencia floods. The outrage we tend to see, what's the local government doing about this, hits hard very early. And so some local governments have come to me from overseas. I do a lot of international presentations and said, we're starting to see that now. What can we learn from Britain? Which I think is fascinating, that we're sort of exporting our outrage.
No, and I mean the cash not stuff resonates. I remember we did some online seminars with Ukrainian local government just after the invasion, and that's basically saying, please stop sending us stuff. And
Yeah.
if you're going to send stuff, please ask us first what stuff we need, because we don't have time to be. Um, but I've heard you talk about this before, the sort of rebelliousness, defiance within community. This, and that you see that as a positive. That people, that outrage, that sort of ability, people say, what are you doing about this? Why isn't it good enough? It is a positive thing, and there should be more of that around the world.
I love it. And I think one of the big mistakes, and more, comms teams are agreeing with me and we're working together. And actually, some of the best comms I ever worked with is in local government. But one thing I really advise comms teams to do is not try and chase approval, chase trust. I don't want to live in a society of 100% coalescence. I learned that in the pandemic. I applaud dissent. The first chapter in When the Dust Settles is being a child of Merseyside in the 80s, and the profound effect that the Hillsborough disaster had on me with some classmates at the game. And I don't want to see a world where there is no challenge. So I often think what we particularly see, I'm seeing it in a number of spaces at the moment. I do a lot of education conferences, and I'm seeing it with head teachers and governors. It's made the news recently. Lots of head teachers and governors kind of chasing, no, you're wrong. I'm coming in on your WhatsApp group to correct you. Yes, we did empty the bins. No, the rats aren't the size of cats. You can see I'm obsessed with bins at the moment. And
Yeah.
so one of the things I would say is don't chase approval. Work with the idea. So when I'm training, for example, or doing presentations for local government leadership, training for working alongside trust, being brave enough in your emergency planning exercises to have an inject, which is about you. You're being accused of stuff, rather than the flood is here. This is what's happened. Actually, what if really the crisis you're managing is coming very internally? The flood is being managed, but the criticism feels overwhelming. The personal doxing, we've had instances in the past where chief execs and others have been shown to be on a beach at the time that the incident was happening. All of those kind of things. Be ready for that and expect that.
So
There there is one caveat I would make, which is I think for some recent incidents, local authority staff, and I say this with great caution, but I will put it on the record, you don't have to take a severely abusive behavior. And we've always trained, and always, as I say, those first totemic incidents that I did, I was training alongside American colleagues. We've always trained that the environment after disaster can be very hostile, very aggressive. But what you don't need to do is tolerate either high levels of verbal abuse or physical abuse. And I'm seeing some very unregulated spaces, exhibitions, public meetings, where really people haven't thought about the rules of engagement. And it is quite distressing sometimes to see, particularly from central government, a sense that at local government you are just expected to take very high levels of abuse. And that is something I do challenge, and I'll challenge with back to a community as well, and that's what I've also become known for is being fair, I think, in this, which can sometimes be a difficult position to take, but correcting a narrative. So you will have seen me come in social media on the Heathrow situation that I don't really think anybody who makes what we call a very difficult emergency planning on-off decision, whether something runs, that is one of the trickiest decisions you can train in local government on off. And is something happening, or do we call it? I don't like to see the kind of vilifying of the individual if possible.
No. So a couple of questions coming in from the audience, sort of picking up on that. One from James in Hackney, sort of asking, what, if that is, why is there more of that sort of outrage at local government in the UK possibly than in other places? Why are we an outlier in that? Why is the United Kingdom an outlier in that regard?
Yeah, so this was actually one of the things that there's a brief reference to it in Where the Dust Settles in relation to going out to New Zealand after the earthquakes and showing them, some of our disaster aftermath and them saying, well, this seems very cynical. Britain had got there very quickly. And that gave me pause for thought. It's a great question to kind of think, well, what is different? I do think there is a kind of traditional British culture of sudden, kind of who's to blame? Where do we go to look for answers on this? The angry of Tunbridge Wells type stereotype. As I say, I'm very here for it. And one point that I made with Heathrow was the chief executive of Heathrow Airport is Danish, and not to get sort of xenophobic on this or champion the British way, but very early on, for example, he came out in his comm statement said, haven't we done well? That's just not a British thing. So I think there's certain ways that Britain responds to emergencies, which when you look at a pattern, we go to wanting answers quite quickly, which, as I say, I'm very here for. This more seriously, because I was asked to look at it specifically in relation to our responses, slightly different sometimes in mass fatality responses, was that Britain, we felt, had been shaped by a series of disasters, which you will be probably familiar with. It was called the Decade of Disasters, which proves that academics can't count because it was about 15 years rather than 10. And they were totemic: Hillsborough, Marchioness, Lockerbie, Herald of Free Enterprise, Piper Alpha, analysed and written about beautifully by the bereaved and survivors in a book called Collective Conviction, which I think there's a copy behind me, and written about in terms of the terrible state-inflicted violence, really, both in the initial response in terms of initial behaviours and then in this very long, fraught legal aftermath. What we always knew a pandemic would do was amplify that. So people would trust less, they would demand a more authentic truth. This was well known in kind of epidemic studies that people would feel very, very let down, very failed. And one of the things I find bizarre, but I understand it, is that we're trying to plow through in local government as if the last 5 years didn't happen. So we
Mm.
already went to outrage quite quickly, and now it's within an hour. People are like, "What did you do?" Because the social contract was broken. They feel very, very failed by the state, and unfortunately, the most obvious representation of that is local government. And you'll be seeing that in other things as well: antisocial behaviour, littering. These were all things in the years 2004 to 2019 we listed as after pandemic consequences. And really, it shouldn't be for me, a crazed one person woman band, to tell you these things. This is the sort of thing that should have been briefed out. It goes back to your first question: what can we learn? And one of the difficulties we had with central government in the early stages of the pandemic, when they were putting out guidance to you, is they go, oh, yeah, but what you're using there is disasters and other types of epidemics. It's not lessons from COVID-19. So unless it's a specific disaster, it won't be the same next time. Whereas in fact, what you're living through, outrage, the break of social contract, antisocial behaviour, understandable industrial relations strains, all of those things, absolutely predictable in this kind of climate.
And that's really really interesting, if slightly depressing. There's another question we had in advance, which picks up on that. But I should say, audience, please drop questions in the chat or put up the Zoom hand, and there's a lot of people on the call, so it may take us a while to find the Zoom hands, but we'll try and get there. Given that context, Lucy, that you just described, how do you the sort of ongoing effort to support residents and community groups to become more resilient long term and to rebuild post disaster, that, given that how do you do that in the context that you've just described and in the context for for many people in many local government jurisdictions around the world, not all, but a great many, of massively restricted budgets, perhaps unrealistic expectations. How do you do that long term?
And this is an independent view, as I say, and possibly may feel a little bit of an overreaction, but then that's always the battle us Cassandras face. Is I would move your kind of thinking process quite significantly to a reasonable worst case scenario. And one of the things that I would say is you don't go into any kind of event, flooding, sudden geopolitical change internationally, let's say, food crisis, all of those kind of things, without a relatively robust social care system and health system. So and I've had several direct messages I can see and coming in through my website as well, sort of like, please bang the drum at central government level. It's all very well for certain central government departments to sort of tinker over here, but we have to help people be weller, feel like there's more money in the bank, all of those kind of things. It is very difficult to do. But if the situation changes pretty imminently, we need to be really clear in that community impact assessment about where we are right now. So I'm a big fan of sitting down with my public health team and looking at the data. As soon as I'm asked to get involved in either readiness or aftermath response, public health are a go-to area under the Health and Social Care Act. I'm very interested in things like indices of deprivation. I'm very interested in things like, which we don't always collect, it's quite hard to get, but things like levels of insurance, contents and home insurance are really good indicators for me of how resilient an area might be. And that is problematic. For example, in some Orthodox religions, insurance is haram. And so for example, in strict Islam, and so we see very low levels of insurance, even if outwardly people are looking to be doing okay. And insurance is the model by which we manage financial resilience in UK local communities. Theoretically, I'm going to instance at the moment where only 13 in 100 people have contents insurance. So my question would then be, who is supporting the other 87 in 100 people to get back to some kind of baseline they were before? So I'm sitting with my public health team. I'm getting a lot of information on a really perfunctory, kind of slightly performative level. One of the things you're likely to be asked to do with your local citizens over the coming months is ask them to think about their own citizen preparedness, which I write about a lot. You'll see lots of tweets from me. I've just been interviewed for Australian media about what to have in your 72-hour kit, what kind of power banks I have for my phone. I have to live as I practice what I preach. So what kind of wind up torch and radio do I have? All of those kind of things. There's always an ambivalence there. People cannot afford food, school uniform, treats, mobile phone bills. And I'm saying to them, and also if you wouldn't mind getting ready for extra things. But I really would like to change the mindset. And certainly one of the things, again, it's stark, but it's pessimistic optimism, is three really important words, which is a real challenge to deliver in local government because it's not what your mantra is. But to citizens, sometimes it's imagine if help isn't coming. And imagine if we need to get as many people through as we can. What does that look like in terms of analysing where your community assets are, your warm spaces, thinking about access to food banks and also kind of swap shops and other things. So I did a big thread at the weekend that was widely reshared on if help isn't coming, and the thread was about how expensive food is going to get.
Yeah.
We urgently need, for example, central government to change its position on things like baby formula, the price of baby formula. I watch very closely dairy, cows, grain in Ukraine, and I know that will mean infant formula goes up. So really thinking about not just being asked to distribute a leaflet that will probably come out in the next, I don't know, 12, 20 weeks at some point from central government. There are also web pages, but also what else do we need to do as communities? And shifting everything to looking at it through a lens of getting communities through. So fixing potholes because we need to be ready, sorting bins because we need to be ready, which is a strange mindset, but one that I really kind of unpick a bit in Come What May.
Yeah, and perhaps we could say a bit more about that because I guess that help isn't coming, that shift to a resilience mindset. within communities. That I think you would say is a universal message. It's something that the governments and local governments around the world should be doing, because in a disaster, there is no state, there is no that is sufficiently kind of omnipotent that they can guarantee that it will sort of take care of everyone. But what are the sort of for a council? What are the sort of communications that you need to put in place to which, because that's a very stark message. It's not coming. How do you do you do it as starkly as that, or do you finesse that? What's the way forward?
I
How?
think it's very hard for you to do it, and as in the role that you have, I think as independents and through I remember being in the early stages of the pandemic, and the One Show, yeah, 7 o'clock magazine show asked for a feature on me on kind of what do pandemics do to society. And when I pitched all of this, they went, "Yeah, no, we're not running that."
Yeah,
So one of the things is like, I can get away with it in this meeting in this space, but it is a very difficult one. And I delivered it in delivered help isn't coming as a key theme at Trinity College in Oxford a couple of months ago, and there was this visible silence, even from very learned scholars. There was this moment where it was like, what is she doing? Why is she doing this to us? So I'm not necessarily saying it's where you come from. There's a couple of things you mentioned, I think probably a question earlier that I didn't fully answer. You mentioned this issue about managing expectations, which in some ways is a very problematic term, but in another one is probably where we're going to have to go. I get a lot of criticism, for example, if I say things like plan to be able to take your own relative to hospital, plan for long waits in hospitals, plan to do a first aid course so that you can address things at home. So when I tweet on citizen preparedness, people will say, this isn't right. This is what local government should be doing and central government should be doing. Why are you filling in the gaps? But
yeah,
I think one of the things is for example, perhaps your autumn comms. So thinking about it now as leadership, in your autumn comms, be talking about things you can do to get your household, your house of multiple occupancy, your family to think
yeah,
about readiness in the winter. So those comms need to be written now to be put out in September,
yeah.
but also,
Or in 6 months' time if you're joining a
yeah,
start.
and be sharing things about the difficulties and the challenges, and be doing so. Some local councils do a lot more internal podcasts for staff now, and also the other thing is all of this starts at home. So I'm always very interested in what local councils are doing for their own staff. That's often an early question I'll ask if I'm working with a council. Some of them have 0% loans, some of them have support schemes, some of them have financial support schemes, and some of them, I mean, it pains me to see, but we are now seeing food banks within councils for council staff. So oxygen mask philosophy and emergency planning, looking after you first so that you have some readiness. Because one of the things that I've seen is the irony in recent years, particularly after emergencies, is officers helping households who are earning more than they are, very low wages sometimes comparatively to what people have in the private sector. And so public sector staff are actually some of the most vulnerable in your community. So taking that challenge on as well.
Thanks.
Oh,
I mean, gosh, bearing in mind that we only have 15 minutes left, that is a can of worms.
it's a brilliant
But
question.
for
And
non, sorry, just
yeah,
for non-UK people, there's a process going on in England at the moment where government is seeking to reorganise about 40% of councils into new, larger entities, a sort of amalgamation. Lucy.
and and obviously this is an area where I often defer to colleagues who are still in local government, and again it's got international applicability. Any big change to a local government system, whether it's in the UK or overseas, what you immediately want to be doing is, while the process is happening, prioritizing, of course I'm biased, but prioritizing your responsibilities for emergency planning, which are very clear under the Part 1 of the Civil Contingencies Act, and ensuring how they will be protected with the change. So that's something I know a lot of colleagues are very anxious about with devolution and with change. And then similarly, if and when the changes fully come in, looking again at the emergency planning responsibilities within those. There is some positivity, I think, from my field, that it may clarify things. we still have, whatever happens, we still have a big problem with central government understanding the role of local government and indeed the bigger geographical functions that we call a local resilience forum. So constantly banging the drum about it, even, as I say, something you'll be able to watch in June. There was even misunderstanding between central and local government. Pretend we played an exercise about the role of local government. Interesting thing with devolution is, again, I'm seeing that some mayoral systems are not understanding particularly our legislative framework. So again, for international colleagues, I think one of the things, and it become very relevant as soon as we've had local elections here, not assuming that, say, a calendar year is enough to do briefings. Whatever changes come in, the emergency planning position and the civil contingencies position here in the UK and the legislation stays the same. And I'm not seeing frequent enough briefings to whatever the structure is that it looks like. And particularly, actually, mayorally, I'm sometimes seeing quite big deficits in knowledge. And also, maybe sometimes with great political leadership, the devolved roles can be quite desirable. I'm not always seeing an understanding that there is existing plans and planning. Sometimes with political leadership, people will want to come in and put their own stamp on it. And
Yeah.
we've had a number of instances now where mayors perhaps have really taken a lead, and I call it, in When the Dust Settles, the scrambled egg effect, when leaders who haven't trained turn up to show their crisis leadership. So quite dangerous times, but also there's always opportunities which I'll be taking from colleagues in terms of how to go forward.
That's interesting. Again, if slightly concerning. Lucy, we've got just over 10 minutes left, so I'm just going to sort of flag what I'm going to ask you so you can organize. So we've got a question from David on the chat. It says, could it be that local government may be seen as an ultra-large container vessel which will require a series of meetings before the captain can change course to take effective action? Which is a lyrical question, but I'm going to interpret it as, what's the sort of tension between what is sometimes quite a sort of bureaucratic set of institutions and the need to respond quickly? We also had a question which I can't resist asking you come in beforehand, which was, where on a scale of 1 to 10, where do you rate AI as an existential threat? To which I would add, or does it have potential to help us with disaster management? And then after you've dealt with those tiny questions, some top tips. We'll finish with some top tips for colleagues around the world on what local government needs to do to be readier.
Yeah, and I mean, it probably will be AI that destroys us all. So to answer that one first, and
I
then
was
I've got
hoping you wouldn't
David.
say. I was hoping that you would say, "Don't worry, it's all fine. It's not."
And it's one of those where, when I say I get up, throw my cereal in and get on with the day, I'm reading constantly. And I think one of the things that, it's not like there's a set of texts. There are lots of texts for emergency planners, but you I often find some of the best informed, say, boards and scientists and others are reading this variety of sources all before breakfast. So you have to constantly be reading pro articles, con articles, what's good about something. And that was a really interesting thing about when I first started using social media, which I did in the pandemic, was if I posted two articles, one said, AI is great, one said AI is really worrying, people would say, I don't understand you. Why have you posted two different articles? And that's the joy of being a kind of critically reflective scholar. So constantly being alert to something. On a very practical level, I think it said in our chat that AI meeting notes are being used. And I think one of the things, for example, in emergency management is we are often very, very attuned to where the legal system is going. And for example, AI notes are not allowed as a form of logging in many of our emergency response colleagues, what we call strategic coordinating meetings. So making constant decisions and paying sort of attention to legal positions. So the idea is that AI sometimes fills in the gaps and tidies stuff up, and that would not be seen as a candid contemporaneous record. So not allowing it to just totally dominate, but using it effectively and working out, still showing it that humans have got a little bit of their own position on this, perhaps, is where I currently am with it. But like any threat, whether that's a novel virus or whatever, just being very, very alive to it. And what some organizations are setting up are what we call the tactical advice cell, which is essentially a reading group. So a space where you can, without somebody saying, why are you clogging up my inbox, sharing into interesting articles that have perhaps no immediate link to today's job list, but your manager is going to understand that you're feeding that into technical advice. So one of the things, for example, as an author, The Atlantic published a list last week, thousands of books are on it, of those that have been scraped by Meta, and When the Dust Settles is on there. And my editor sent me articles about what to do if your book has been scraped by AI. I'm not too worried at the moment, but those are the kind of things that you kind of are keeping this constant brief on. So opening your ideas up and being alert to your own CPD. For David's point, I would obviously completely agree with David on that, but I do think one of the things we haven't been able to do because of the very tragic nature of it is celebrate the good of the pandemic, not the pandemic itself, but our work, our innovations, and local government. You'll see me tweet all the way through. And indeed, if you want a visual proof, you saw me go head to head with one of our own Prime Minister's advisors on the news that local government had been incredible in the pandemic. And that I felt really challenged the idea of the very hard to move container ship. You were flexible, public health was great. There were lots of kinks, there were lots of problems, but we've not been allowed to say what worked. And one of the things that stuns me is being invited into organizations, even with, even now, being, tell us what we need to do. And you're like, you taught me for 5 years. You were incredible and continue to be so. And I'll always be your biggest champions. So I think, you got saddled a little bit with the idea that you were very immovable, very kind of jobs worthy. And then you kept this great globe alive across the world. So I think it's really time to reframe your identity in that. There's one from Giuseppe in there. In moving to become part of a bigger council, the key thing that must not be lost is the ability
Yeah.
to respond
A,
quickly. Yeah,
com a
absolutely.
comment
Yeah.
on agility and size, which I think reflects
Yeah,
your point
and you
about risk.
and thank you for that, just because you mentioned there the Godstone Road collapse, which I've shared some threads about. Um, I've just done the coal authorities conference, because one of the things that I would say is the future is all going to be about sinkholes, road collapses, culverts. Haven't gone into it too much detail, but I do hope you are booked to give colleagues updated lessons soon, because you are dealing with something that if they're not dealing with now, they will be. That's what we know will happen from a kind of combined mix of climate change and Victorian infrastructure, and that's true of other places in the world as well. So this idea of the sinkhole phenomenon is remember I told you it, but also you're dealing with things again like expectations. We saw a news broadcast with that particular road collapse that said residents were hoping to be back next day. We know with things like road collapses, they are incredibly complex. So I really do hope you're getting a chance to share your lessons and also looking after yourself, because they're incredibly complex recoveries, and look after your colleagues, please, and yourself.
So those themes of sharing and caring for oneself and one's colleagues, and as you said, the oxygen mask, caring for yourself so that you can care for others, have come out really strongly. So let's take those as two kind of tips. But with 5 minutes left, I'm gonna push you to give us a couple of sort of top tips for local government colleagues. And this event is part of our Future Local Lab, which is trying to bring together learning from around the world, and we've got people from lots of different places here. So for colleagues around the world, a few top tips on how you kind of build increased resilience.
So that gives me a lovely chance to ask you to, if you can and if you can afford it, to pre-order it on both Audible and Spotify and as a hard copy book, come what may, because that's all about. It's not those kind of lessons identified that we know from inquiry reports. It's not bigger radios or more kit. It's the lessons that I brought home to my own life. And I want you to start with yourselves. And I really want you to think about your own well-being and your own care in all of this. There'll be, if you can't afford it at this time, my website will be constantly updated. There'll be a lot of press over the next few weeks with media outlets that I'm doing on kind of self-care tips that are more meaningful, less about privilege and access to very expensive retreats. Thank you. The link's in the chat. But a couple of things that I would say, couple of challenges that it'd be interesting to watch what happens to me, see how they land over the next few weeks. So one of them is hopium. So removing hopium from both your personal planning and your work planning, being too optimistic in your scenarios, does it's not depressing. I promise you. It doesn't mean that you don't delight in the day or love hard. It just means that you're being more realistic in your planning. And then the second thing that I think we might find is the chapter on two truths, which is about balancing lots of different opinions. That's really, I'm going to be thinking of
Mm.
you in a month's time when, I'm being asked about media interviews. Where do we have to balance multiple truths? You with your elected members. And then there's some really personal chapters about dealing with grief, bereavement, the meaning of things. And maybe it's a stretch, but I've taken what I've done in my work home. So things like chapter 2 is about the impact assessment, and it's about in disasters we write impact assessments of all the things that have happened outside our window, but we don't do that at home. And some of the hardest hit workers over the last few years are public sector workers. You're constantly slammed, you are constantly misunderstood, and you're often, kind of often in what we call the kind of custard cream generation. You've got caring responsibilities with both older relatives and younger children as well. And you're really hard pressed. So maybe looking at your own approaches, and particularly, if I may say, to men, looking at your own ways that you look after your own mental health, and it makes us better allies. There's some things I call out in the book, some behaviors, lots of toxic positivity. Maybe somebody's come back to work after a miscarriage and you've said, don't worry, you can try again. So I hope it's a slightly different self-help book, because it is quite gently challenging, but ultimately you've met me today, you've met me in the podcast. Big hug for you all, and you'll never ever lose my support of you and of local government.
Lucy, that is a challenge and a hug. Feels like the ideal combination to finish on. Look, we're amazingly grateful. Look, I should say it's in the chat, but we will follow up with everyone. We'll send you all a resource pack with a recording of today's session, a link to the previous interview Lucy did with us, some additional LGIU content around all of this, and crucially, a pre-sale link to Lucy's new book, Come What May, available in all good bookshops and possibly some bad ones as well. But we buy it wherever you can. So we can't wait to get into that. As I said, this is part of LGA's Future Local Lab. We're trying to bring together insight and learning from experts like Lucy, but also from practitioners like you around the world, so that we can all share, we can all learn, and we can all, as Lucy urges us, gently challenge each other.
Thank
I
you.
promised you would finish at 11, so I'm going to end just with real thanks to Lucy and to all of you for participating and making this a fantastic event. Lucy, thank you so much. I really.
Oh, thank you. And a lovely message from Alison, who remembers me from the early days. Alison, you just sent me a message. It's so lovely to hear from you. That's the only problem, really, is being originally in local government. Everybody remembers the early days when none of this was coherent.
Everyone always does. Lucy, thank you for your time this morning. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you all at the next event. Bye bye.